All right, let's get started. Hi, everyone. I know I'm standing between you and hopefully getting to chat a little bit more before you all take off, and it's a while before you see you again. But I'm Rick Byers again. This time I'm wearing a different hat. I work on our transactions team where we do identity and payment stuff. And so this is an API I'm working on with a few others called the Digital Credentials API. And so just to give some context, that digital credentials can be lots of different things, but the thing that has a lot of momentum right now is government identities. So, for example, there's an ISO standard that's been defined for quite some time for mobile driver's licenses. And I think -7, I think it was actually yesterday, -7 got published as a way to get a mobile driver's license on the web without browser and OS involvement at all, just by using this custom URL scheme, mdoc://. So a website can navigate to the scheme. If you've got something like California DMV wallet on your phone, it can listen to the scheme and say, okay, let me share information, get users permission, of course, and share information about your government identity with the website. So you could use your California driver's license to log into all sorts of websites or prove your age and stuff like that. So you're probably all immediately thinking, is this a good thing? Is this something we want? Or what's the ways this might go wrong? Let me just expand a little bit more. It's not just California. Much of North America now is rolling out mobile driver's licenses, various stages. W3C has been working for a long time on this thing called verifiable credentials. And these are all types of verifiable credentials. And the key thing that makes them different, it's very much like federated identity, like normal sign into Google, sign into Facebook, whatever. The key thing that makes it different is there's a new holder. There's a new party that we call the three-party model that we call the holder, which kind of acts like another user agent, right? Your wallet is a user agent acting on your behalf, trying to help you manage your privacy and manage your identity. And this has some interesting upsides and challenges. But anyway, W3C has been working in this space for a long time, but browsers have largely been ignoring it for a long time as something that happens on top of the web rather than in the web. There's also lots of other government entities. US Immigration has a whole bunch of verifiable credential stuff. Microsoft has an authenticator app that for a long time has supported these kind of IDs. You can use QR codes to sign into websites using these kind of verifiable credentials. And most recently, a law is passed in Europe called eIDAS 2.0 that requires every European member state to make a government digital identity available to their citizens and compels some major companies, including Google and Facebook, to accept those forms of identity in their login systems in some fashion. So this is kind of what really got my notice. I was like, oh, we can't just ignore this anymore. Like, people are going to be using these things to, to sign into their Google accounts or recover their Google accounts or something. We should think about this. But there's been a whole industry here. I've only learned about this in the last year or so, but there's like a big industry, all sorts of momentum over the last decade even, working on this topic. And browsers kind of only just decided in the last 1 or 2 years that like maybe we have an opinion on how like unresettable, unforgeable, permanent government identities are used across the entire web and everything that exists on the web. There is some upside that I think is interesting. Like I was saying before, it's similar to federated identity, but it can actually have a much better privacy model. One of the things that a lot of people don't like about social sign-in services is you're kind of phoning home to the identity provider every time you log into a website, right? One of the things the mobile driver's license people say is like, look, you use your driver's license to buy alcohol. You don't have to tell the DMV, every time you buy alcohol. Like, isn't that a property we want in the identity system? And so a three-party identity system like verifiable credentials gives us potentially that property. Additionally, along with that property, maybe we can do a better job of selective disclosure where you're only disclosing certain things. There's a lot of movement in governments and other forums right now around age attestation online. Is it possible to securely prove that you're an adult without also disclosing who you are, or in a way, or being able to link yourself across different websites? Maybe. I'll get into some more details on that soon. There's also a lot to be interested in around the security of this. If you're operating a business online, a lot of this, I think, was supercharged over COVID, where a lot of things had to move online. You can no longer rely on someone coming into a bank to do something. And many of you have maybe seen, if you tried to open a bank account during the pandemic, maybe you had to get on a video call with someone. Well, guess what AI is getting better and better at being able to fake is like videos of you and your face. So, you know, maybe we can help, you know, improve security of a lot of online activity. And you know, everyone knows passwords are terrible. So, you know, this is another type of identity authentication that, you know, could be lower friction. And one thing that's really interesting is the idea of the wallet as user agent is another kind of point in a whole identity system where the user's choices might influence the incentives, right? So maybe wallets are going to compete with each other to be the most private wallet, and you're going to want to pick a more private wallet over one that doesn't have as good of a privacy reputation, for example. Okay, but there's an awful lot of risks. I'm guessing a lot of you are already kind of thinking of some of these. A few of us have explored these in the context of the ping at the W3C has a document called Credentials Considerations I helped author. You can see this link afterwards if you like. But a couple of things we're talking about, obviously privacy. You know, do people actually understand what they're disclosing? You know, I mean, especially because this is not just you typing your name. This is like you providing a cryptographic proof that your legal name according to your government is X, right? How do we decide? Like a lot of this just brings in the whole question of online trust, right? How do we reason about trust online? What websites are trustworthy? What identity providers are trustworthy? What are the different degrees of trustworthiness? There's all sorts of risks. You know, if you've been following all the privacy sandbox type stuff around, you know, the value of identity to advertising, for example, right? You know, it may be that sites are going to want to strongly encourage you, you know, hey, share your driver's license and in exchange, you know, get a coupon off your purchase or something like that, right? As kind of stakeholders in the web, what's the browser community's opinion on that kind of stuff? One I've heard a lot from Mozilla is discrimination, right? You could imagine, for example, if like, hey, 80% of the countries in the world have a digital identity system, and then, you know, maybe all of a certain type of class of content online moves behind these kind of walls. Well, what happens to the people who can't get these digital identities? Either they're not offered by their state, or maybe they're undocumented or something, right? There's a real risk of, you know, maybe if you live in a smaller country, maybe websites only accept credentials from like the biggest 100 countries or something. Free expression, you know, like depending on, you know, the government under which you live, you know, if more and more things require you to present your legal identity to, for example, participate in social media, what's the implications of that? And this is another kind of point of power in the whole online dynamics that could be abused by gatekeepers that, you know, or could act as a centralizing force in various ways, something that we should keep an eye on. And even just from a security perspective, what does it mean? Hey, if we're going to use if these identities are required by law to be allowed to recover an account, what does that mean for, you know, compromise of government keys or maybe state actors? You know, like, you know, some security agencies are awfully good at minting government identities. So anyway, lots of hard questions here. I don't have answers for them in the next 20 minutes, but I do have a rough framework of what we've tried to design to try to help make sure that the browser and the web community and the, you know, the W3C ethical web principles and all that sort of stuff can at least play a role in this thing that's going to happen on the web, whether we like it or not. So we're building an API, and we've worked hard to try to convince people in this ecosystem that we have something to provide, that if they work through our API, we can offer them some things they want. You know, so in particular, we can solve this problem of wallet and credential selection. One of the big problems today with these custom URL schemes is it's just a website that talks directly to a single app, and you're probably going to have multiple apps on your phone. Probably want to get the user's consent to pick which one they want. So we can fix some of the UX issues by having a browser API. Also, something that matters a lot to me is I think the browser is acting as the user's agent, and so should have the ability to introspect these requests. You know, if you're going over a custom URL scheme, sometimes some of those protocols just establish a back channel network connection between the wallet and the website. And there's nothing we can do to reason about, hey, is this a privacy preserving age request? Or is this a tell me your full legal identity that's unresettable, right? So we can't help guide users in their kind of privacy moments. So this is something we've insisted on that actually a lot of the ecosystem was quite resistant to. A lot of them thought, you know, oh, you know, big tech's trying to get access to user data, trying to, you know, but it's, you know, we think our job as a user agent is to be able to help explain to users what's about to happen with their data and help them make an informed choice of what they want to do with their identity information. But something we were willing to give up is actually we don't want to see the PII. Typically, these systems are built so that the responses are encrypted in an end-to-end encryption way, so that the requester sends a key, and then the wallet encrypts the response using a hardware secure element on the device. At the moment, most of these are mobile wallets. There are desktop and web wallets, but most of them are mobile wallets so that they can rely on TPMs and other secure elements. And then the response gets encrypted and sent back to the server and only decrypted on the server. And that's something, it means that there's certain types of abuse we can't detect, but that's a trade-off we're willing to make in order to say, like, no, we're not doing this to try to hoover up users' private information. That's not our intent here. And then a key one for us is you'd be familiar with in the threat model of everything that we do in the browser is we want to make sure we're getting the user's confirmation before communicating anything with some other application each and every single time. And today, unfortunately, with custom schemes on the web, sometimes this isn't obvious, but basically any website can communicate with many different apps on your phone without you ever even knowing, because all it has to do is navigate to one of these URLs, and there's often not, both iPhone and Android, there's often not any kind of interaction with the user. Okay, here's a concrete example. So this is using the credential management API, so same basic API that WebAuthn passkeys uses, as well as FedCM. And so because of the principles I described earlier, one of the keys here, because there was a big industry already investing in this space, is we intentionally tried to decouple the credential selection piece from the the protocol for communicating with wallets is what our interest is in, and then there's existing protocols for how exactly you formulate a query and what the credentials look like that we're not touching. So one of the most popular query protocols, and the one that's being written into law for EIDAS in Europe, is called OpenID for VP. It's standardized at the OpenID Foundation, who does OAuth and stuff like that. So this is one example where the browser piece that we've defined is the navigator credentials get with a this property where you say digital, right? And then you can have a list of requests, and those can be different protocols. In this case, we have an example of OpenID. I've omitted some because it's kind of long, but I can show you a bit more in a minute. Yes, and now I'm going to tempt the demo gods and see if I can do a live demo for you. Digitalcredentials.dev, and this is just a little test page that we built that lets you put the properties that you want. So say, for example, you only want to know whether somebody's over 21, then this is going to make a request. This is the JSON. It's going to go into the request. There's a nonce for the encryption. This is the actual definition of the query. The query is saying that it's a MDoc ISO format credential that we want, a certain crypto algorithm. And where's it here? The one property we want is the age over 18 Boolean. Oh, so actually, sorry, this is age over 21. Age over 21 Boolean. There's this extra thing that says intent to retain. It's a privacy thing. Like this is saying that the requester promises that this isn't for storage. This is like a one-time thing. So if I hit that request credential, then I get this UI. So this is a lot of the work actually here is Android. It's not Chrome. This is a credential picker in Android. It's part of the Android credential management framework. And just whoops, that's right. I swiped that away when I meant to swipe sideways. So I've got two different credentials registered. I have Erica's driver's license and Rick's driving license. These are just self-signed credentials in a test wallet. And when I say continue, oh, come on now. Retrieving token. Okay, hold on a second. Let me try again, and this time I'm going to do with name and portrait and request. We have two different ways of doing this. Let me try this way. I did this yesterday. I swear it worked. Rick's. Oh, give me a break. Why is this not? It worked yesterday. Let me just quickly kill it and try once more. Request. Let's try OpenID again. So this is an extra interstitial we've added, and there's a whole debate about when should we show this, when should we shouldn't. But part of the principle here is I think the browser should be in control of deciding when it thinks something is riskier and not risky, and being able to warn users. Notice that didn't show up when all I was doing was requesting the age over 21. Come on. Okay, well, sorry, you're just gonna have to believe me. It worked yesterday on my device. Probably something changed, Sam. Um, you're going to try to do it? Okay, if you can get it, you can. Oh, it's broken on your phone too? It worked yesterday. Jeez. Okay. So anyway, let me go back to the presentation. But what you would have seen. Hold on. How do I? Sorry. Let me just get this presented again. What you would have seen is it just would have popped up my photo and my name and whatnot, because it would have been able to get the data back from the wallet that I have on here and shown it to the web page, right? So that's not the interesting thing is actually the credential picker. And what's neat about how Android has built this is it's general to any kind of format of credential, but the wallet learns nothing until the user clicks on it. And you might ask, how is that possible? There's like wallet matching code running, but the wallet doesn't actually learn anything. Well, they took a page out of our books and they built a sandbox that actually uses WASM. And so they run these little matchers using a WebAssembly interpreter that they built. It's kind of neat. Okay, but this is the step-by-step of the journey. You know, website makes a request, there's an Android UI selector, and then you go into the wallet app. And this is where the wallet app will typically have some, give you some message about what you're sharing and with whom, and then you approve usually with thumbprint, something like that, and then it's sent back. Also, we did a demo almost a year ago now at IAW. We did a demo quite a while, or maybe it was 6 months ago, IAW actually, with Apple showing cross-device flow. So this uses the same technology as Passkeys cross-device called CTAP hybrid. So you can have a credential that's kind of locked into the secure element on your phone, but then use it on a desktop browser. And this actually works across Apple and Google ecosystems, or will work across Apple and Google ecosystems. But we demoed this. There's an example. Okay. So overall status is there's an experimental API in Android that people are starting to use. We have a Chrome origin trial that started running in Chrome 129. There's patches landing in WebKit. There's some experimental support in Google Wallet right now. We've had a blog post that talks about this. And in particular, there's a flow today where if you have a Google account where your birthday says that you're a child and you change the birthday to say that you're an adult, Google puts you through an age verification flow today. It's a pretty unusual thing for someone to change the birthday such that they become an adult when they were previously a child. So if you do that, it goes through this flow, which will soon be able to use the Google Wallet support and the origin trial support and the Android support all together for you to be able to prove with like your California driver's license, for example. We have a draft spec that we've been working on, the YCG. And a couple months back, we started a process to recharter the W3C's Federated Identity Working Group to include this. Brave has had a formal objection. And it's actually interesting. We had a great talk at TPAC. The things they're worried about all the negative consequences of government identity online are all the things we're worried about. And I think most of us, including Mozilla and Apple and many others involved in this work, just think we can mitigate those risks better by having a web API rather than this whole ecosystem developing without using any web API. There's a lot of interesting comparisons to all the different types of identity and payment systems we have. I probably won't go through all this in detail, just to say that the thing that's fundamentally different from autofill is that this is a cryptographic proof, right? It's not just a bit of text. I've talked about custom schemes. There's risks with custom schemes around greater chance of phishing, for example. There's an interesting question of like with other forms of federated identity, where does the credential store? Is it in the browser, which can let you offer something lower friction, or is it in some other app like a wallet, which might enable more flexibility and competition, but come at a cost of more friction? There's a lot of similarity between this and passkeys. In fact, you can almost think of passkeys as a self-issued digital credential, right? It's just that passkeys doesn't have anything but your identity. It's just a credential from a wallet app, could be one of many password managers. And kind of interestingly, there's a lot of things people have wanted from WebAuthn that WebAuthn has not been willing to give, like device binding and cryptographic attestation, that people are going to build into this because we don't control the protocols on this. This is way more flexible. So it's going to be some competition for WebAuthn in a way. There's also a lot of overlap with what we've done in payments. Already Europe intends to use this for payments. They'll be, probably there will be Android UI where in addition to picking a credential, you see like, do you want to spend $5 with this merchant? You know, confirm or deny. One of the really interesting trade-offs I find in this whole space is, and actually this comes up a lot in web platform design, is the tension between a high level of abstraction API and a low level of abstraction API. You know, we've talked about this in the UI space around, you know, extensible web ideas of low level versus high level CSS APIs. But here, if you plot the different credential and payment systems that we have on the web, there's this interesting spectrum, and I don't think there's any one perfect fit. But you know, we're seeing the challenges of the different extremes, right? Passkeys can be great for this common, simple use case, but it's not very flexible. There's lots of things you might want to do with passkeys that you can't do. So we can move further down and get more custom, but down at the bottom, there's OAuth can do whatever the heck you want, but by not having any support in the browser means that it's you have less ability to provide security and privacy protect the browser to help with security and privacy protections and whatnot. Oops. Okay, we got a lot of stuff that we're still exploring here. Like you saw that interstitial that got shown. How should the browser reason about which identity presentations are risky, which aren't? This is a whole dialogue that's happening. For example, in Europe, you will have to get a trust mark from the government basically to be able to request any of these credentials. You know, we think that's probably a pretty good property, but you know, in the US, the approach is different. The government doesn't feel they're in a position to say who should be allowed to look at your driver's license and who shouldn't. So, you know, how should we reason about that in the browser when we're trying to communicate to the user how risky it is to share this information? How can we monitor for abuse? I'm hoping we're going to be able to collect a bunch of aggregate data about how this is being used on different websites and make it available in transparency reports, for example. And then what the heck do we do with desktop? This cross-device flow is not great. Can we have wallets on desktop? You know, could you build a PWA as a wallet? And then what do you do if there's abuse of wallets? It's a whole can of worms. And then a big one is this question of unlinkability of selective disclosure. You saw my demo about proving that you're over 18 or over 21. Turns out all the systems today for that are actually deployed, many of them, most of them that are deployed, are not as private as you might think they are. So concretely, there's an issue of verifier to verifier linkability. So if you present your age on one site, some of the implementations use a salted hash technique where they reuse some of the salted hashes. And so it might be possible for two different websites to correlate you and say you're the same person. That's obviously bad. So you shouldn't reuse your salted hashes. But how do we know if salted hash has been reused? But then there's also a question of issuer verifier linkability. You know, what happens if your credential issuer, your government, is hacked and has a data breach? You know, can their logs then be joined with the logs of a website where you verified your age in order to say this, you know, here's a big data dump of all the people that verified their age on whatever website, pick your favorite website. And so that gives rise, there's this really interesting exploration. It's been an academic area of cryptography research for a long time called zero knowledge proofs. And I think the consensus is moving in the direction that the only way we're ever really going to solve this three-party model where you have an independent wallet that's not phoning home to a credential issuer, but can still present an age attestation in a way that's really unlinkable is probably going to be with a zero knowledge proof. Now, I don't understand the math behind these things. It's like crazy crypto, but it lets you prove, for example, that you hold a credential from one of n different issuers without revealing which issuer. That's another important property, by the way, right? Just because I gave you a credential saying California says I'm over 21, well, now you know I'm a resident of California. You know, maybe that's not a big deal for California, but maybe for Rhode Island, it's a bigger deal. So, but a zero knowledge proof could say, the requester could just say, I trust these 212 different issuers. Can you give me a proof that the user has a credential that's over 21 for one of these 212 issuers? And you basically just get back a Boolean along with a proof that proves that it's true. It's pretty neat. All sorts of problems are required to actually make this practical, though, and actually deploy in the ecosystem. But anyway, I think this is the direction that we're going, and I'm excited to see. You know, it's going to be an important capability, I think. Which then, you know, just brainstorming, taking a step back and thinking about, you know, if we start to have this kind of system, if we start to have zero knowledge proofs, and if a lot of people have government identities on their phone, one of the hardest trade-offs that I think we face on the internet is the trade-off between things like privacy on the right-hand side here, right? Private, like we all want privacy, but we also have to acknowledge that perfect privacy means perfect immunity for criminals. So when we have privacy, we tend to also have disinformation, trolling, harassment, fraud, and it kind of sucks that we have to take both of those at the same time. But the other extreme, I would argue, is even worse, which is like, hey, we want trust and we want criminal justice, but as soon as we build systems with trust and criminal justice, it means, yeah, we're probably going to get tracking and gatekeeping and maybe in the extreme authoritarianism. And this feels like a fundamental trade-off in a lot of the debates we see online. And wouldn't it be great if we had some way that, not saying that there's any silver bullet, but maybe there are some win-win opportunities in the middle. So in particular, there's this emerging idea of a personhood credential. It may be possible to say, hey, you're visiting google.com, and here's a cryptographic proof that you are google.com's user AB2F, and every time you come to google.com, you will be user AB2F, but it's anonymous and unlinkable, and you can never reset it, right? So it would basically be derived from your passport or something like that. And if we had something like that, it may be that we could build systems in the internet that allow privacy and anonymity, but also allow reputation systems, allow someone to be banned for violating a code of conduct in a way that they can't just come back without, getting their government to issue them a new passport with a new identity, for example. And that, I don't know, it's interesting. Like, as much as all this stuff is scary, I find it a little bit inspiring to imagine, a web 5-10 years from now might let us have a trade-off in this tough trade-off space that's kind of better than anything we've been able to do today. If you want to know more about any of this, there's a ton of resources. It's pretty messy. It's like it's quite chaotic. We're trying to centralize some things onto this new website, digitalcredentials.dev. It's still a work in progress. We have a GitHub repo. The work right now is happening in the context of the YCG, the incubator group of the W3C, and we have a component for our implementation in Chromium. And that's all I've got. And I think is there a bit of time left for questions? Yep, so happy to take questions if anybody has any. Thank you. Do you want to run mics?
Yeah, I'm running mics.
So that was a really good talk. I guess setting aside most of the issues that I can spot, and you've kind of pointed out most of them, what prevents fraud in this type of system? Like, there's been so many large-scale data breaches, and we're using numbers that shouldn't be identifying like Social Security is used for creditors and things like that. Like, what prevents someone from just buying a huge slew of identifying information and then creating these keys?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I'm gonna ignore the fancy zero knowledge proof stuff for a bit because that's kind of science fiction future. I mean, you could ask the same question about the web PKI system, right? What prevents people from just getting access to the TLS certificate for google.com, right? And it's like, well, yeah, they might be able to. Google invests a heck of a lot to make sure that their private keys are not available to anybody else. And so, but it's a good question. How are the different issuers, how well are they going to do at protecting their key material, right? And is government going to get hacked and have their like root signing keys compromised such that malicious actors are able to mint credentials? And are we going to be able to handle all the revocation necessary and whatnot? Certainly sounds like a big problem. Luckily, unlike the web PKI, I don't think it's the browser's problem. This is part of the reason why I want transparency and control for users. Like, one of the things I'd like to be able to do is if, pick your favorite country, has a big data breach, ideally we'd like to be able to push a configuration down to Chrome that says, just deny any credential request that looks like it's for one of these credentials, that we now know it's compromised, right? Just as a backstop, just in the case that, credential issuers aren't able to manage their own revocation system and risk management system properly. But yeah, it's a good question, and I have no idea how this is going to play out.
Given the entry of browsers into this space, is the MDoc protocol going away, or is that still being recommended?
So when we say MDoc, normally we mean the 802.11-5, the format for the credential. And then there's the custom scheme, which I think what you're asking about, right? MDoc://. So today, the -7 standard was just published that references that scheme. the big question was, are we going to be able to offer enough that people are going to prefer to use this over that? And so a year ago, I would have said, I have no idea. We might be too late. Actually, it still is true that we might be too late. A year ago, I thought we probably were too late. Now I think there's enough understanding, enough interest that we can offer a more secure system and a lower friction system through this, that I'm hopeful. But still, it depends on, are we going to get enough support for this kind of thing in enough browsers and enough operating systems in a fast enough time that the whole ecosystem doesn't ossify on the thing that works today. And so that's what we're trying to do, and that's why we feel some urgency, is to reduce the risk that these deployments go out large scale and just the insecure systems are always there because that's what worked first. But hopefully, luckily, we have some flexibility here, right? It maybe we reach a point where collectively we agree that when a browser sees an m.colon// URL, maybe we should have similar warnings to the user. Or maybe, when this whole thing started, we entered this space by saying, we're going to block these. So that was maybe a bit of a, it was an interesting move in retrospect. What we've been told is that got their attention, got the people's attention that was working on this. I don't think blocking is the right strategy because the reality is this stuff isn't ready yet, but it's close. And so I hope we can get to a point where we could say there's no reason to ever use a m.custom scheme.
This is Andrew from Microsoft. Thank you for the great presentation. You mentioned that, if I understood correctly, that the user would need to basically grant permission every time their information would be accessed. And I was just curious if there were conversations about if the customer wanted to opt in for, do it once and then every time. It seems like there's maybe precedent on, mobile apps and other kind of permission structures. So curious of your thoughts on that.
I think the way we're thinking about it now, so much of the momentum is around this real world identity, government credentials. We're being very cautious. I think what we would say today is, if you've got a high frequency use case, trade the digital credential for a passkey or something, right? Like trade it for a cookie, use DBSC or use any technology so that any system that's saying you have to present your government credential once a day is probably not, I don't really want to be training people that presenting their government credentials is something they're used to doing all the time. So at the moment, I would be opposed to any kind of remember me, yes, just automatically approve. But this technology is useful for not just government credentials. It's maybe useful for like movie passes and loyalty cards and stuff like that. And so maybe we get to a place where we can differentiate the risk level. And maybe for fully anonymous credentials, maybe it does make sense to have a, don't ask me option. But that's not where we are today.
Do you have any thoughts on how the system could be built to handle the case of folks who are undocumented or in countries that haven't deployed these kinds of systems?
I mean, I think the reality for the next decade, honestly, is like, it's not like this is going to sweep the globe overnight, right? Like, I mean, you look at how hard is it to get people to move from passwords to passkeys, right? When are we going to get to a world where it's okay to not have a passkey or to not be allowed to use a password? Right? Or, I mean, similarly, even for like, it's pretty rare even these days. There are environments like, for example, I was surprised that Ticketmaster, I think, recently moved to a model where the only way to present your ticket when coming into a concert is with a mobile phone, right? We crossed the threshold after, what, 20 years, or whatever, 17 something-ish years, depending where you start, that enough people have mobile phones. So I think the scenarios where people want to take one of these, it's an important enough transaction, right? It's often a business transaction, or it's important enough transaction that they're going to want to offer people multiple choices, right? There's going to be the take a video, do a selfie check, record a picture of your driver's license. All those things already exist. I imagine those choices are going to exist for some time. Like even Google's own age verification system, we have a third party that we work with that uses AI to look at your face to decide if you look like an adult. That's one of the options that we give people today for proving that you're an adult to Google. I imagine those kind of things, the multiple options I imagine are going to exist for a long time. Hopefully, I mean, because we're intentionally creating an ecosystem of competing wallets and competing issuers, right? Maybe there will be new issuers who spring up who are kind of the issuer of last resort, right? How can people get credentials who can't get credentials through the normal path? I don't know. It's a tough ecosystem problem, I think.
Yeah, so there are many tough ethical questions here, and I want to raise an even tougher question, even tougher ethical question, which is how are those ethical questions selected? Because I feel like there are, for example, which questions do we consider and which questions do we not worry about, and how concerning those different risks are, and people from different cultures or people hold different philosophy may have very different opinions. So yeah, how can we make this better and more inclusive?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Part of it, I think, a lot comes down to choice, right? Different browsers are going to make different choices, right? Like obviously, Brave is going to make a different choice than Chrome. And so users can choose what browser they want to use, right? Users can also, it's already the case that users with different philosophies are probably going to choose from different mobile phone providers, right? If security is really important to you, there's some manufacturers you're more likely to choose than if you don't care at all about the security of your mobile phone, right? So I'm hopeful. Part of what we tried to do here is make sure there aren't choke points, right? Make sure, so this is one of the reasons, for example, that we allow for multiple different credential formats, is to enable there to be some competition in the ecosystem that hopefully enables, some amount of democracy in all this, right? But yeah, it's going to vary, and obviously it's going to be different in different jurisdictions. And,
So some countries today are considered like tax havens. Could you imagine like an identity haven that would just like, create these? And is there any protection for that kind of situation built into this?
Yep, absolutely. So this is, the trust model is basically, you want users to pick their wallet, but you also want issuers to pick a set of wallets that they support. And then the verifiers choose which issuers they trust, right? The verifiers, these are end websites, right? The websites don't have to worry about, do they trust wallet X to wallet Y? They just say, I trust credentials from the following issuers, right? So, hey, if somebody advertises themselves as, a place that anybody can go and buy credentials, there's probably not going to be a lot of verifiers that use those credentials for anything interesting, right? So hopefully, like, I'm a big fan of marketplaces. I think marketplaces help align incentives and, set prices, and so hopefully there's going to be a marketplace of options here, and there will be higher, like, high attestation credentials, ones that are, when you're filing your taxes or getting a government benefit, right, that's going to want a secure element that, and a wallet that's gone through a rigorous security process and that sort of thing. And when you're using your movie pass or your loyalty card, right, they're probably going to be willing to accept a lot more. And so hopefully we're going to see a market of choices and options that kind of self balances in that way.
I guess on that sort of like market choice question, I feel like the concern that gets raised here is that it's not actually going to be much of a market, because if sites end up incentivized, for sort of anti-abuse, anti-fraud reasons to only trust government credentials, then there's only one provider of government credentials for here, right? It is the government of California, the government of the United States. And so you don't really actually have a choice.
You're going to get some competition. If you remember, there was this slide, but at the very least, you're going to have competition in the US between the issuer of your passport and the issuer of your driver's license. But yes, I agree. Like, there is real risk that, and part of this, I hope, will be met. If you look at what's actually happening in Europe around EIDAS, there's an awful lot of public debate, right? And there's a lot, politicians are trying to make sure they're accountable to their citizens in the design of this system. And, there's almost certainly going to be, there has been a lot of pushback about these systems already. It seems to be leading in a pretty good balance in EIDAS, but it's going to be different by different jurisdictions. And at the end of the day, we're talking politics at the end of the day. So.
All right, looks like that might be it, Rick.
All right, thank you very much. Back to you, Todd.